Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really well. Today we are going to be talking about what makes a novel boring. So, a really common complaint from aspiring writers is that they've put a lot of time and energy and effort and passion into their stories, but for some reason their novels are just a little bit boring, maybe more than a little bit boring. And even to them as the author or the writer, they can read through it and feel that it's just not that engaging, it's not that exciting, and they really can't see it having that spark or that specialness that would make it stand out when submitting to agents or publishers or when self-publishing. So today I want to talk about 10 common reasons that I see for novels that are a little bit boring. It's likely that if you do feel that your novel is boring, that it's a combination of these 10 things, and you may be doing some of them well under some circumstances and not as well under different circumstances. So hopefully you find this helpful, and it will help you to identify those things in your book that you might want to change to make it more interesting and more exciting, and to just ban boringness from your novel once and for all. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Number one, the writing is too generic. A really common problem with especially early drafts, but this can be something that maintains over multiple drafts if it's not something you're looking out for, is writing that is just too generic. It's something we often don't think that much about. We might just think that a boring story would have bad scenes or bad structure, but the writing itself can often be the problem. So over relying on really generic wording, so wordings that we've seen many times before, we sort of tune them out. So the reader sort of stops trying to interpret them, and that hurts immersion. So things like Snow White or Ruby Red are examples of descriptions that we've heard them so many times that when we hear them, we don't even really think about or try to imagine what's being described. We can also have this problem if we rely too much on cliches, so things like he went stiff as a board or she jumped out of her skin. If we use those kinds of phrases too often, a lot of the time what can happen is the reader just loses immersion because they're not really interpreting those phrases. We've heard them so many times, they sort of just wash right over us and we don't really think about them. And the reader really wants to see what's special about you and special about your character. So while uniqueness and unique wording doesn't have to be dripping off of every single paragraph of your whole novel, we do want to put some of ourselves as the writer or some of our point of view characters' personality into the writing so that it feels more unique and more interesting. So instead of relying on those common expected phrases or expected descriptions, it's really helpful to try to put our own unique spin on things, especially when we want the reader to really be thinking about and really be imagining what we're describing. Number two, chapter endings are too tidy. While we obviously don't want to use cliffhangers, very big, bold cliffhangers for every single chapter because that could get rather tedious, rather predictable, we do want to leave the reader wanting more. So something that we can do that can make a novel boring is sort of answer the pressing questions and tidy everything up at the end of the chapter so that the reader doesn't really have that strong urge to turn the page. So we don't want to make it super easy to end a chapter, put the book down, and never really think about it again. We want to raise those questions that get the reader excited and interested to continue reading. That doesn't mean that we have to dangle our character off of a cliff at the end of every chapter, but we do want the reader to be wondering something. So that might be what will happen next, what will they do, how will they react, how will they feel, what does that mean? We want some questions to be raised to help the reader to continue their journey through the book. That can be as simple as wondering what the character's emotional reaction would be. So maybe something really unusual happens at the end of a chapter but we don't see the reaction, we don't see the emotional reaction from the character. The chapter just ends. The reader will feel compelled to continue reading just to know how are they going to react to this, how do they feel about this, especially if it's something really unexpected. We're going to be wondering, how are they going to feel? I bet they're going to be so upset, I bet they're going to be so stressed out, how are they going to solve the problem? Those are the types of things that can help us to keep reading and to not want to put that book down and forget about it. It could also be a change of plan. So maybe the character was planning something, they're sort of executing things, and then they hit a big roadblock. Hitting that roadblock can raise a lot of questions about what they're going to do next, and it can be really compelling to the reader, making them want to read that next chapter to see how the character fixes the problem. Number 3, questions are answered before new questions are raised. While raising those smaller questions at the end of chapters can really help to keep the reader invested and engaged in the book, on the broader scale, we also don't want to answer those big plot questions without having raised other big plot questions. So something that can happen is we might raise a question like, how will the character achieve a specific goal? But once the character does achieve that goal, if we haven't raised another question, the reader might feel that the story is complete enough for them. They've gotten the answer to that question that they had. They don't really feel that compelled to continue reading. So it can be really helpful to raise multiple questions at once. That way, when we do answer a question, there's still another question in the background, or there's still another question that the reader will want to see answered. So examples of overlapping questions, so multiple questions you might have up in the air at the same time, are things like, will they or won't they get with their romantic interests? Will they or won't they raise enough money to start their dream business? Will they or won't they identify who the antagonist is? These are questions that could be present in the story simultaneously, so that when one is resolved, there's still other questions to keep the reader interested and invested and to help them to want to continue reading. Number 4, dialogue only functions on one level. So something else that can make a story feel rather boring is when there's a lot of dialogue that really only functions on one level. So often this is the writer's intention. So what the writer wanted to bring across with the dialogue. This could be a piece of important information. It could even be emotional information. But really the dialogue only works on one level. It's just about what the writer wanted to convey to the reader. This can be very boring, and this can very quickly bog the story down in a lot of really slow sections. So it can be really helpful to keep in mind that dialogue should work on multiple levels. So you have the level of the writer, what the writer wants to convey to the reader, what they want to achieve with the dialogue, but you also have the motivations of the characters involved in the dialogue. So you typically have at least 3 different motives: the writer's motive, what they're trying to convey, the protagonist motive, and the other character, whoever they're talking to, their motive. There could be even more. Sometimes characters have multiple motives or multiple goals in the same conversation, or sometimes there's more than 2 people involved in the conversation. So we want to have a sense of what the characters are trying to achieve, or we want at least the sense that they are trying to achieve something. So we might not know what the non-point of view character is trying to achieve, but we still want the sense that they are in fact trying to achieve something. We don't want dialogue that feels as if it's just there to convey information, because that can be rather boring. It can also be helpful to consider that in many cases the characters aren't going to be direct about what they're trying to accomplish with the dialogue. So we don't usually enter a dialogue and say, okay, here's what I want to get out of this conversation. This is my goal. And then the other person goes, okay, this is my goal in the conversation. Often we want to hide our goals in some way. We might be fishing for information, but we don't want to just come out and say we're fishing for information. Maybe we're pretending that we're interested in something we're not interested in because we want someone to like us. So there's lots of different subtextual elements that you can put in where the reader would have to read between the lines, and that can really make the dialogue feel more realistic as well as more compelling. So make sure that your dialogue is really reflecting what your characters want, and also a natural way the character might go about achieving what they want. And that way the dialogue won't just be there to convey information. And it can also be helpful to keep in mind that the other characters also have things that they want, and so we don't want them to just react in a very boring or basic way. Number 5, plot events feel random. Sometimes if we get the feeling that a story is kind of boring or it's not really that engaging, we might think that throwing in random plot events will make it more exciting and more engaging for the reader. But this often has the opposite effect. While, of course, occasionally we can have a plot event that sort of comes out of the blue and is really surprising, typically doing this too often actually has the opposite effect, because instead of being excited and interested by this crazy out of the blue event that occurred, instead the reader sort of feels that things don't feel like there are boundaries or parameters. The story feels like anything could happen at any time. And it's very difficult to raise tension when it doesn't feel that the doesn't feel like the writer is following a set of rules, that the world doesn't work in a specific way, that things could just happen at random. This lowers tension because it doesn't make things feel realistic. It's especially a problem when solutions come out of the blue, because if your character comes up with solutions that were not foreshadowed in any way, that we had no way of knowing were possible, instead of being exciting and an interesting moment, it feels kind of like a cop-out or kind of like cheating. It doesn't feel like this is something that was genuinely clever or genuinely unique. So while our stories can come together in surprising ways or even shocking ways, those ways should be in some sense foreshadowed, in some way not necessarily predictable, but not completely out of nowhere. So we typically want to set up skills that the character might use to solve a problem. We typically want to foreshadow or set up bad guys or negative plot events. Even if the reader could have never predicted that that thing is going to happen, we still want it to feel like it's rooted in the world, like we set it up to be there, not like events are just happening at random. Because though it can feel very counterintuitive, strange random events or really intense random events can feel very odd and can make the story more boring by making it less believable, by making the world less believable, and by making it feel like the writer almost is just cheating or using cop-outs to progress the story. Number 6, emotions have replaced introspection. So while it's okay, obviously, at times to simply state the character's emotions, she was sad, he was angry, etc., if we're using these emotions to replace introspection, it can make a story rather boring. Most readers find just being directly told the character's emotions to be a little bit boring. But the good news is that the vast majority of readers find introspection to be extremely interesting. So introspection is when we walk the reader through the thought process of the character. So we're expressing the thoughts and the reasoning that the character is experiencing internally. We're not just saying he decided this, or he was sad, or she wanted X. Instead, we're walking through their thoughts and their feelings and their reasoning behind how they're getting to the conclusion that they ultimately get to, or maybe even we may be circling around the emotion without ever directly stating what it is, because often characters, just like people, aren't really going to directly think about the emotion that they're experiencing. They may not even directly think about their reasoning or directly think about the why behind how they feel or the why behind their actions. Often introspection is going to take a form that has a lot of implication and a lot of subtext and a lot of reading between the lines, but the reader having to sort of interpret that internal world and that internal thought process is a lot more engaging and interesting. It makes the book so much more compelling because you're asking the reader to take more of an active role in truly interpreting things. That's the same as I was mentioning with using overly simplistic descriptions. The reader at that point isn't really interpreting. If you just say she was happy, he was angry, the reader isn't trying to imagine very deeply what that means. You're just telling them what to think and how to interpret things. So introspection really invites the reader into the story. It helps them to engage with the material and really think about what it means and what the character is truly experiencing. Number 7 is low stakes. We might write the absolute coolest story with the most interesting plot twists, but if there aren't stakes for the protagonist, in most cases it's going to be very difficult for the reader to truly care and truly engage with the story. So we definitely want to look out for low stakes as a culprit for a boring novel. So there are 2 things to really look out for with the stakes. The first is that the stakes feel important. So they should be extremely important to this character. But we also have to sort of meet the character where they're at in life. So extremely important to this character is going to have to be proportional to that character's experience. So, for example, a middle schooler might feel that the stakes of not being able to be in a school play and become popular are just enormous. These might feel like just huge stakes to a kid who's 11 or 12 years old. Older characters or characters in a different circumstance might have stakes that are much, much higher, but to the character, the stakes will always feel extremely high, extremely important. So we never want a character who themselves doesn't think the stakes are super important. They should find the stakes to be pretty much the most important thing going on in their life at that moment. So we want to make sure the stakes are high for the character. Secondly, we want to make sure the stakes are as firm as possible. So this means that the stakes need to be something that the character truly believes will definitely happen if they don't achieve their goal or if they don't prevent it from happening. So, for example, if we have a character who might lose their job, that's not going to feel like firm stakes. If it's a strong maybe, it's not going to necessarily be compelling enough to the reader. A much stronger circumstance would be something like the boss of the character directly telling them, if you don't do X, I'm going to fire you. Those are really firm stakes. Sometimes the stakes might just be something the character truly deeply believes will happen, even if they're never directly told, and that can work as well, but it needs to feel very firm, very definite. Even if it only feels very definite because of flawed reasoning in the character, that's okay, but the character needs to truly believe that this thing is at stake. So those two elements of the stakes, making sure it feels very serious and important to the character, and also that it feels very firm to the character, can tremendously help with engagement. It can really help the reader to feel that the story is really compelling, and it really helps the reader to not get bored. Number 8, character motivation isn't clear. So just like with the stakes, often we can feel that if we've given the character a goal, that should be sufficient in getting the reader engaged. We might also think if we have both a goal and stakes, that then the reader will be interested, that they'll stay compelled to continue reading. But the motivation is extremely important because it acts as sort of the glue that ties everything together, and also it's what sort of makes stories feel important. So the motivation is the character's drive for a common human desire. So this could be a desire for something like security or happiness or love or anything that is a sort of common human driving force. We might not all have the same external goals. We might not all relate to what the character wants to achieve externally, that tangible goal, but typically we can all relate to these internal driving forces, these motivations, the desire for safety or love or security or something along those lines, those basic human driving forces. So the motivation can really help to make sense of the character's actions. It can help tie together why they think that this goal is so important, because they think that the goal is going to satisfy that driving force. It's going to help them achieve whatever that human desire is all about. The stakes will also take away whatever that desire is all about. So again, it helps to create that sense of importance. It helps to tie everything together. So often when we have a boring story, we may have failed to convey the motivation adequately to the reader, or maybe the motivation isn't really there at all and we've mostly been focusing on the goal. So make sure that your character does have that strong desire, that human driving force behind their actions, because it will really, really help the reader to invest in the story. Number 9, scenes lack momentum. Another common cause of a boring novel is that the scenes just don't have a sense of momentum. Sometimes writers can get bogged down in what they wanted to achieve with the scene, so maybe they're primarily focused on information that they wanted to convey, or maybe an emotion that they wanted to bring across, but they're not as focused on that sense of momentum out of the scene. So this is very similar to the problem that can happen with dialogue, where we can focus too much on what we as the writer wanted and not enough on what actually makes for an interesting or engaging conversation. So scenes are the same way. We want the scenes to be interesting and engaging, and one way we can do that is to make sure that there is that sense of momentum. So we talked previously about how we want to raise questions or we want questions to remain at the end of chapters. We don't want to end a chapter with everything tidied up. This is sort of similar to that, but it's a little bit broader. So we don't just want there to still be questions. We want a sense that the scene moved things forward. It could also be that the scenes moved things backwards, but really it's still moving things forward by going backwards. Or if the character has a negative outcome to a scene, they have to pivot and do something else. So even though we might say, oh, well, they moved backwards because they failed, it still creates a sense of momentum. So we either want there to be a sense that the character has to pivot towards something because they failed, or pivot in a new direction because they've now taken a step forward. So maybe they have succeeded, they've achieved one step forward in their plan. Well, now they're moving on to that next step. So we want some sense of movement in the plot, some sense of momentum at the ends of scenes. This could be internal, so it could be something that the character concludes or something that the character realizes. It doesn't always have to be something external or something literal. They don't have to have literally achieved something in the plot, but there should be some sense of movement. I also want to mention here that by scenes having momentum, that doesn't always mean that the scene ends at the end of the chapter. So scenes are really story units of a goal, some sort of action taken by the character, and then an outcome. So there will be a conflict, but that conflict may span multiple scenes, and that's okay. I just want to be clear about that. It's okay to end a chapter in the middle of a conflict if that makes the chapter more compelling or raises better questions. But when we're looking at scenes, we're looking at units of the story. We don't want to have scenes where the character is just spinning their wheels, where nothing is achieved. They're not moving backwards, they're not moving forwards, they're not failing, they're not succeeding. Just maybe in most cases we would see this because the writer is just trying to convey information or just wants to bring something across to the reader, and they're not really as focused on what would make for a compelling plot line. So make sure that your scenes really have momentum and they're really pushing and moving the plot forward. Number 10, you forgot to be entertaining. Sometimes we can focus so hard on getting the plot structure right and the scene structure right and having the perfect character arc and getting everything just exactly perfect that we can actually forget to be entertaining. We can forget that writing is really about entertaining the reader. That's not to say that you should generally ignore writing advice or generally ignore structure or the character arc or anything along those lines. However, entertainment value is so important that it trumps everything else. So if there's a way that you can be entertaining by breaking rules, that is more important. The entertainment value is more important. That's not to say that you have to break rules to be entertaining, but if breaking rules helps you to be entertaining, that's okay. We want the reader to be excited by our stories and interested in our stories. We don't want to be boring just because we're trying to really be perfect or really follow every rule that we've ever heard of just to the most perfect T. It's okay to be a little bit loose. It's okay to have fun. It's okay to put your own personality into things. It's okay to deviate from what's expected. We don't want to follow every rule if it's going to make our story very rigid or very boring. So while I do think it's important to follow rules when possible and when it's beneficial, which is going to be in the majority of situations, so most of the time for your book, most of the rules are going to be worth following. Most books do break the rules at least on occasion, and it's important to do that if we need to do that if we need to be entertaining. With that said, we can also forget to be entertaining even within the rules. So it's not that following the rules means that things aren't entertaining. We can follow every single rule and write a book that is perfect in terms of following the rules and still have a book that's super interesting, super exciting, super entertaining. But we have to think about what is entertaining to our reader. We have to think about who our reader is, what they're going to find interesting and compelling. And we have to make that a big part of our writing and editing process. I also really, really can't overstate how much these things will improve with editing. So often our first idea of how to word something, it's going to be pretty boring. Even our first idea for how the character is going to react or our first idea for a conflict in a scene is probably going to be a little bit typical, a little bit expected, a little bit too boring. So a lot of this will improve through the editing process as you try to think through ways you can replace your boring wording or your boring conflicts or your boring introspection with something that's more compelling and more interesting and more dynamic. So make sure that you are allowing those things to grow and develop in the editing process and that you are thinking about how to make things as entertaining as possible for your readers. So that is all for this video. I really hope that you found it helpful. Let me know in the comments if there are other things that you think can make a novel boring, or things that stand out to you frequently as something that just makes you want to put a book down, whether that's a published book or books maybe that you've beta read or that you've read from your critique partners. When you guys watch this video, I will be on maternity leave. I am currently 8 months pregnant, and so I may not be able to respond in the comments. We'll see how I'm doing and how baby is doing, but I just wanted to let you guys know, if you don't see me replying in the comments to this video, that's probably why. If you want to help support the channel and you want to help support me have a maternity leave, I will put a link to my Patreon in the description. At the $5 and up tier, I do a podcast every other week where you guys can ask questions, and I will try to help you guys even with specific problems you're having with your novel or broader questions that you have in general. It's a lot of fun, so if that interests you, you can check that out, and I will be pre-recording episodes to come out during maternity leave. So if you want to check that out, the link is in the description. Thank you so much to all of my Patreon supporters who are helping me to have a maternity leave. It is so hard to have a leave when you are self-employed, and I really appreciate being able to have this time with my baby. So I really hope you found this video helpful. I will be back with a new video soon, and in the meantime, happy writing, guys.